Passage 5. Listen to part of a discussion in an art appreciation class. The professor is discussing Cubism. Cubism.
Cubism had its origins in France in 1908. Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque, who were living in Montmartre in Paris at the time, are said to be the founders of the movement. This new form of art was considered to be avant-garde, new and experimental, and it turned out to be a very influential art movement that revolutionized painting and sculpture in the 20th century. Some have even said the movement was the most influential movement since the Italian Renaissance.
What does Cubist artwork look like?
Well, the objects in a Cubist painting are broken up and then reassembled into an abstract form, and the object is shown from multiple angles. And, well, it was using geometric forms to express ideas. Some art critics thought the pictures looked like a bunch of little cubes, and that is how the name Cubism came into being.
How did Picasso and his friend, the other painter, come up with the idea of Cubism?
Let me explain the beginnings. While Picasso was in Spain in 1906, he painted a picture of a female and made the picture's surface look like broken glass. The female's face had very sharp and angular lines. Picasso was trying to paint the woman from all angles and directions. His picture had no spatial depth, and her face was shown as almost a mask. African art, as well as Greek and Spanish art, all had influences on the way Picasso portrayed this woman. So, when Picasso and Braque began working together 2 years later, they began by trying to develop this style of painting. And the first phase of Cubism was called Analytical Cubism, because the pictures showed objects which looked as though they were working against each other. And the art showed densely patterned surfaces that were mainly monochromatic. The analytical Cubism pieces also had a lot of surfaces with incomplete directional lines.
What about later stages of Cubism? Were the paintings in the same style?
The second phase was called synthetic Cubism, and this phase began in about 1912. In this phase, whatever was drawn had superimposed parts. For example, a lot of different objects were brought together to create new and different forms. And sometimes things were even pasted onto the canvas. Really, the beginnings of collages. Some of the things that were pasted on the canvas were brightly colored items, like scraps of advertisement and wood. So color was now being reintroduced into Cubist art. Also, they varied their paint applications and used sand to texturize the works and combs to make ridges and lines. Picasso also used a lot of dots to show differences in spacing and suggest transparent planes.
But what kind of a background did Picasso and Braque have that got them into this style of painting? Picasso was Spanish and Braque was French, so I am not sure how everything came together.
Let's talk about each man's background so that you can understand the development and the timeline.
I don't understand what you mean by timeline. I thought Cubism began about 1908.
Well, it did. That's about when Picasso and Braque began working together. But I mean the timeline of their lives and the art styles they were developing. Picasso had begun painting by the time he was 10 years old, and he was admitted into Barcelona's School of Fine Arts when he was 15. When he was 17 and 18, he made several trips to Paris. And in 1904, when he was 19, he moved there. He liked the Bohemian district in Paris, and many of his early paintings were of people in the dance halls of the district. As he painted more, he began to use a lot of blue paint, and his work showed a lot of poverty, misery, and the ugly side of life.
So you're telling us that this is why Picasso has a blue period of painting?
Is that the same reason Picasso has a rose period? Because he used rose-colored paints in his pictures?
Exactly. And when Picasso and Braque met in Paris, they teamed up and began the Cubist-style painting. But let me tell you a little about Braque too. Braque was born in an area close to Paris, and he became a house painter. His father was a decorator and house painter, and Braque was going to follow in his father's footsteps. Then he moved to Paris to study painting, the fine art of painting. He liked bold styles and brilliant colors, and he liked painters whose painting forms were loosely structured.
Well, was he older than Picasso?
My guess is that they were about the same age.
Braque was a year younger than Picasso, and he moved to Paris a couple of years before Picasso. Braque liked Cezanns' paintings, and you probably remember that Cezannes used some distorted forms and different perspectives in his art. So when Braque and Picasso met, they had each been developing a similar style painting. Braque used a lot of rectangular geometric shapes and neutral colors, and his paintings looked both flat and three-dimensional. And Picasso was painting in somewhat the same style. They teamed up and began working together and developed an artistic movement which transformed the world of art.
Now get ready to answer the questions. You may use your notes to help you answer.
Number 24. What is the discussion mainly about? Number 25. Where does the professor say Cubism had its origins? Number 26. What are the phases of Cubism? Click on two answers. Number 27. According to the discussion, what are features of Cubism? Click on three answers.
Listen again to part of the discussion, then answer the question.
This new form of art was considered to be avant-garde, new and experimental, and it turned out to be a very influential art movement that revolutionized painting and sculpture in the 20th century. Some have even said the movement was the most influential movement since the Italian Renaissance.
Number 28. What does the professor mean when she says this?
This new form of art was considered to be avant-garde.
Listen again to part of the discussion, then answer the question.
So you're telling us that this is why Picasso has a blue period of painting.
Is that the same reason Picasso has a rose period? Because he used rose-colored paints in his pictures?
Number 29. What can be inferred about the students?